Okay, we're going to move on and do our chapter 14, section 4, the last section of this chapter, presentation on the Industrial Revolution. This should only take about 10 minutes, a little bit shorter than the last couple that we've done. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution was a revolution a little bit different than the French or the American Revolution in that it wasn't a war. It was like the Scientific Revolution. It was a time of change. It was a time that Europe made big advances in how goods were produced and where people lived and what people did for a living. It was a time period where everything became machine made. Prior to this, pretty much everything was handmade. You made your own clothing, you made your own tools. People didn't have a lot of goods, they didn't have a lot of belongings because it took a long time to make things. So it's a time where that's really going to change, and we're going to start to see factories become important. We're going to see things mass produced like clothing, like tools, and people are going to start to move from living out in the countryside where they work on farms to moving into the city. And again, they sort of go hand in hand together. Fewer and fewer small farms exist during the Industrial Revolution. Europe goes from being an agricultural society where people live out in the countryside and work on farms to Europe becoming a place where most people live in the big cities and fewer people live out in the countryside. And what fueled all this was better technology. Again, the Renaissance, bringing out the ideas of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, got people thinking about things. People started inventing things, inventing machinery. Some of the machinery that was invented, like Jethro Tull's seed planter, made it easier to farm without as many workers on the farm. So large farms started to become more popular. Rich farmers were able to buy up smaller farms, and the people that used to work on those small farms needed to go find work somewhere. Fortunately for them, other inventions were coming into play, like machinery to make cloth, and so those people that used to work out on a farm in the countryside moved to the city to these new jobs that were found in factories. So hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution, we see growth of cities like Paris and London. Okay, and as I briefly mentioned, the Industrial Revolution pretty much started with textiles. And as we've talked about, textiles is just another word for cloth, the cloth that we make clothing out of. People used to make all their clothing by hand, but with the Industrial Revolution, the invention of things like the loom here, you see this woman right here is making off of these huge spools of thread. You can see it better over here. These huge spools of thread are being turned into cloth, pieces of cloth, with this loom that's in front of her that she's working with. So they invented the spinning machine, and it would allow people to make more cloth, make it faster, and in turn, cheaper. Okay. Other inventions that came about during the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine. And the steam engine was extremely important because steam power ends up powering almost everything for a long time in the Industrial Revolution. It powers trains, it powers ships, and we start to see the ability to cross the Atlantic Ocean from Europe to America, for example, under the power of a steamship, instead of having to rely on sails and the wind to make it across. We see trains come into play, and again, the steam-powered engine on a train allows for trains to carry people and goods long distances much, much faster than going on a horse and wagon. The steel industry also came into play during the Industrial Revolution. Steel is tougher than iron. Making steel is basically taking iron ore and turning it into a more pure product that has a much higher strength. This allowed for, again, ships, trains, large buildings that started to be made out of steel instead of wood. And that steel industry is a big part of the Industrial Revolution. We know a lot about the steel industry in Northwest Indiana because we have steel mills in Portage, steel mills in Chesterton, Burns Harbor, East Chicago, Hammond, all up and down the coastline of Lake Michigan here. Another invention of the Industrial Revolution was the telegraph, and the telegraph was a way of communicating. Before the telegraph, the only way to communicate, if you weren't directly talking to someone, was to write them a letter and wait for that letter to get delivered. The telegraph is kind of the precursor to the telephone in that it used wires to transfer signals, but the signals were in Morse code, and that was that series of dots and dashes, of tapping that signified different letters of the alphabet. And a lot of people, once these wires were strung up between cities, to send communications back and forth. The factories that people worked in during the Industrial Revolution were not the safest places in the world to work, especially at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. As I mentioned, that people started to work in factories rather than farms during this time. But those early years of the Industrial Revolution, the factory owners took advantage of the workers. These people were all moving in from the countryside into the big cities. They needed work. They needed a place to work. There was thousands of people looking for jobs. So the factory owners were able to pay very little money, make people work very long hours, and in essence really abuse their workers for quite a while. And the people really, couldn't fight back. The government initially wasn't supporting the workers. They were supporting the rich factory owners. Children, as amazing as it sounds to us, children were also forced to work in the factories. And I use the term forced. Part of it was because the factories paid so little that when the parents went to work there, they weren't making enough to feed their families. So eventually, everyone in the family came to work. Children as young as 6 years old were working in factories in the early part of the Industrial Revolution. Even in this photograph, we see some young boys working on the machinery. This kid's even barefoot. You can see all the places that your fingers or toes could get caught in the machinery. It was a very dangerous job. We also discussed in one of the worksheets that you had on child labor the fact that sometimes the factories would take in orphans, children whose parents had passed away, and in return for giving them a place to live and feeding them, these kids were basically forced to work for no pay, long, hard hours in the factory. Okay. The Industrial Revolution, this new emphasis on industry and factories, brings a new type of economic system into play called capitalism. And that's the system that we have in our country, in the United States. And the idea of capitalism is that people own their own businesses and other people invest money in those businesses. And the number one goal in a capitalist system is to make a profit, to make money. Okay, so we see that in the Industrial Revolution, the factory owners were getting richer and richer and richer as the demand for the goods that they were producing got higher and higher and higher. So the goal of capitalism is to make more money than you invest. And this system still, applies in our country today. People have ideas for a new business or a new invention. They find investors to give them money to help them get it going. And in return, once they start selling their product and making money, they give money back to those investors. Not just the money they borrowed, but some interest. All right, and finally, some results of the Industrial Revolution. Pretty much everything becomes machine-made and goods become cheaper. And we start to become a society where people have more and more stuff, especially compared to what they used to have. We start to see more people in the middle class instead of the lower classes. So we have more people that are doing a little bit better than they were before as far as poverty is concerned, because there's more jobs with all these factories opening up everywhere. Cities grew rapidly, but they were dirty and crowded initially because they simply weren't ready for the influx of people from the countryside into the cities. So it took a while for the cities to catch up with all the people that were moving in. And again, we're talking about we start to really see the big cities of Europe take hold. Cities like London and Paris, for example. Sorry about that. Over time, it becomes apparent to politicians and to the people working in these factories that laws are needed to protect people. We already talked about a little bit about how children were abused, and there were no child labor laws at that time initially. So we start to see laws enacted to protect kids at work. It sets boundaries on how old you can be in work, how many hours a child could work, how many days a week someone could work. It starts to set amounts that people should have to pay per hour, wages, to make sure the wages were fair, make sure that people weren't being taken advantage of. Women were working in these factories right along with men, and eventually women start to realize that they should have equal rights with men. Leading up to all of this, women weren't treated equally all throughout history. And we've seen that time and again and discussed it a little bit with, for example, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where it was the men that did all the business, the women stayed home and took care of the children. during the Industrial Revolution, women start to see their worth, and they start to fight for their rights like voting. And women start to look for the right to vote. They start demanding the right to vote, and eventually they win that fight to vote, which of course you guys know, because nowadays it seems really weird that women wouldn't have had the right to vote. But that was called the suffrage movement, and that's something you'll learn a lot more about when you're in when you're in 8th grade studying U.S. history. Okay, that wraps up the notes on this section.